importantly, Kevin writes on the topic of free will, which Kevin has become pretty well known for over the last several years, where Kevin has been giving us a sort of a naturalized account of free will from an evolutionary perspective. This is most eloquently done in Kevin's book, Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. In this book, Kevin reaches down into the depths of our phylogenetic history, evidencing how across time, as agents, we have accrued greater degrees of freedom, that maybe even simple bacteria, to a lesser extent, have freedom. And the book also draws on philosophy and sort of makes reference to things like quantum mechanics to encourage us to consider a more holistic approach to science, which is also something I've noticed Kevin sort of is something you sort of pay attention to. And therefore, yeah, Kevin is someone who's keen to examine the philosophical assumptions which the current scientific zeitgeist perhaps falls prey to, most notably reductionism.
Yeah, good. Well, that was a lot. Thanks. That's a quite comprehensive overview. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's good for people to yeah. So I'm to begin with, I'm just curious, given, I think, like I said there, genetics and the sort of the development of brain is something formally, professionally you were involved in. Where does the interest in free will come from, or how long is it something you've had for a while, or did you read something in your later life?
It has emerged over the years, and it came directly from thinking about how brains get put together based on genetics, our genetic sort of program that we have. And I use that word advisedly because it's not really the best word to describe it, but the fact that the human beings generally have some genetic instructions to make a human brain, but we all have different variants on those, right? So we carry genetic variants that make our brains differ from each other, just as our faces differ from each other, and so on. And the way that our brains are put together has an influence on the way that they function, and it manifests in these psychological traits that we call personality traits, which essentially are tendencies of decision making, right? So in various scenarios that we might encounter, if we say that someone is more extroverted or introverted, what we mean is that they have a tendency to make decisions, to behave in certain ways in certain scenarios that we just recognize, and we call that name, right? So that got me interested in thinking about decision making and how those variants, how the wiring of those neural circuits, whatever it is in the brain that's different between people who are extroverted and introverted, or all the other personality traits that we can think of, more or less impulsive, for example, or more or less conscientious, how all of those hypothetical differences really manifest in behavior. And if you think about those things, it's easy to fall prey to two kinds of mistakes, I think, or the same mistake twice, right? The first mistake is to think that our genetic variants, whatever we have, completely determine our psychology. And that was really one of the main points of my book, Innate, was that yes, they influence our psychology, but there's a whole load of other things that happen, particularly just random developmental variation, right? You can run the same program twice, like in identical twins, and you don't get exactly the same outcome, just because those processes are somewhat noisy in engineering terms. So it's not right to think that our genes determine our psychological traits. They influence them, but they're not deterministic. And it's not right to think that our psychological traits, the real sort of innate tunings that we have of these different circuits, determine our behavior at any instant, right? So again, they influence it. In particular, they influence how our behavioral patterns emerge through time as we experience the world, right? So those tunings have an influence, but they're not like the tunings of a robot that will just drive us at any given moment. So in thinking about those things, the issue of free will obviously kind of comes up, because we're saying, okay, we've got these genetic predispositions, we've got these psychological predispositions. So when we're making a decision, how free are we? I mean, we're clearly not completely free, right? Because we have those prior constraints. Those are, in effect, the things that make us who we are, or some of the things that make us who we are. But yeah, so that's where the question then comes in. Okay, well, given that, are we just kind of like non-player characters in a computer game where we're just operating, we're just playing out the pre-programming that we have? Where does the freedom come in? And that's what kicked off my journey down the rabbit hole. But of course, there's a lot of other things then obviously start to come in. And one of them, just the other thing to mention at the start, is that there, you referred to the zeitgeist in neuroscience, which is very reductive and very mechanistic. Neuroscientists have been just fabulously successful at figuring out which parts of the brain are active when you're doing something, or in going into animal brains and even controlling different bits of the brain and making an animal do something, or making an animal think something, implanting a memory that the animal never, of an event that never occurred. You can really get in there and mess with the machinery and affect all these cognitive processes and behavioral processes, which makes it look like it's just a machine, right? It's got isolated parts. We can understand how the parts connect to each other. You can dissect the thing like a big clock, or a computer, right? And it's hard to get away from that when you see these successes that we've had. What happens almost is you think, okay, I can see in the brain what's happening when a decision is being made, and it looks to me, as a neuroscientist, that the brain is making the decision. Right? So what happens in the circuit determines what happens in the next one. It's just driving activity around this electrical machine, and that's what makes the decision. And then what happens is you, the agent, the organism, has been eliminated from that process. Right? They're no longer in charge of anything. They're no longer making a decision. Excuse me. They're just waiting for their brain to make a decision, and then they're executing it. So yeah, there was some existential questions that emerge from being a neuroscientist, basically, that I wanted to try to engage with in this new work.
Yeah, brilliant. And in having read, well, I actually listened to the Audible version of your book, and then read a couple of papers, again, which I'll link for those interested who do enjoy this conversation. I do recommend the book. It was great, and also so I'll link that and some of these papers. But yeah, from listening to you prior to this, it sounds like, and sort of leading on from what you just said there, there's this idea of freedom and what freedom means, and posing the question. And it sounds like typically people speak of, it's almost as though people want an account of which is freedom from anything.
Yeah.
Rather, yours is more of a sort of a freedom to. And I wonder if it's just, you sort of said it there around this kind of reduction approach, where it's sort of like, well, we can identify certain mechanisms, and therefore, we have the agent has no free will. We've explained it away. Do you think and this, coming back to this zeitgeist, I know I haven't read much of his work, but I know there's a sort of the face, or one of the faces of it, is someone like, I think, Robert Sapolsky.
Sure.
So, and he would be a determinist, right?
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
So maybe just before we, so would it be fair to say that, and similar to what you just said there, determinists like Robert operate or work from principle or sort of axioms such as like vertical reductionism, horizontal reductionism, and the other main one, external determinism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And what's interesting, so Robert Sapolsky is a neuroscientist at Stanford, behavioral neuroscientist, and he wrote a book which came out at just the same time as mine. And what's really interesting is that two neuroscientists can look at essentially the same sort of body of evidence and come to completely different conclusions about what's going on. Because what I do is present a framework in which we can understand free will in a naturalized kind of way. And what Robert does is look at the evidence and say, all this evidence shows that we have no free will whatsoever. We don't have a shred of agency in any decision we ever make. Right? And I think there's, even below the isms that you just talk about, these types of reductionism and determinism, I think actually there's a dualism at play there. So when I look at these neural experiments that show this part of the brain is active, that part of the brain is active, and so on. When you're making a decision, that's exactly the way I think about it, right? So the fact that there's some machinery at work doesn't mean that you're not making the decision, depending on what you think of as you, right? The point is that you and your brain are not some separate things under my view, whereas under Robert's view, it seems like every time you can take something that you thought you were doing kind of up here and then identify, actually, it's happening in the brain. To his mind, that means you're no longer doing it because he sees you and the brain almost as separate from each other. And I just don't think that philosophical position is warranted or tenable. And it's basically an underlying premise that's sort of tacit. It's not really articulated particularly overtly in his writing, but to my mind, that's what is actually fundamentally driving the difference between our outlooks on the same sort of bodies of evidence.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that, because I actually wanted to bring up this idea of because you mentioned in your book as well, dualism, and I wasn't sure where to sort of maybe ask it, and I was going to put it towards the end, but I think it's good that you've brought it up here, because like you say, similarly, it does seem like that is and what happens, and it's almost as though we abstract ourselves from what we are, and like you talk about is that we are. Well, it's from what I can remember. You say we're sort of instantiated by our neurons.
Yeah.
And also it's interesting because this dualism, even you speak of like the classic Libet study, and it can even inform our how we interpret all the body of evidence, like how your philosophical position will completely can furnish how you look at that study.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And, I don't know who it's been, I think it was Dennett who said, some scientists say, oh, we're not interested in philosophy. No, thanks. That's not for us. We're going to keep on doing our science. And he said, well, you're doing philosophy whether you think about it or not. And if you don't think about it, you're probably doing it badly, right? So what that suggests is, I think what he means is that we always bring some philosophical position to our interpretation of things, even if we're not aware of it, right? And that position of this sort of implicit dualism is one that scientists bring, and it's one that's very entrenched in the general public as well. It's why someone would say, "Oh, my brain made me do it," or "My genes made me do it." These things even occur in legal defenses, actually, which is a weird framing, right? Because it suggests, well, what are you if you're not the things that the thing that is entailed by all of those genes and bits of your brains and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think when we ask the question, do we have free will, right? Then there's some obvious things that we need to define in there. What does it mean? What do we mean by free, right? And what do we mean by will? But there's a less obvious thing that we have to define, which is what do we mean by we? What does that mean? What is the self? What is the entity that we think is the thing that has freedom and that's exercising choice and control? And that's the real sort of issue. And one of the, it's the real stumbling block, I think, for people, because they don't want to be identified just with the machinery of their brain, which is why this idea, this intuition of a spirit or a soul or something immaterial that's extra, that's where that comes about, right? The problem with that sort of immaterial soul thing, as was known, hundreds of years ago, is that if you posit that your mind or your soul is something extra, then you have this immaterial mental realm, right? Then you have this question of how does that interfere with or intervene on the physical stuff that's going on in your brain? So when you're having a thought, how could that thought, this immaterial thing, possibly push around the ions in your neurons, right? It just doesn't seem like those two things could be compatible with each other at all, right? But there's a different way to think about it. And for me, the real key is taking a view through time, right? So rather than thinking of you as this physical object right now with a physical state that could be defined of all the atoms in your brain, right? Right now, that's not you. You are the continued extension through time of an entity. that is keeping itself going through time, that has some historicity to it. That means it's forming memories, for example. It's got a link to the past, and it's got an outlook towards the future. And you right now are just this instantaneous avatar, a momentary avatar of this thing that stretches through time. And if you think about the causation in the system, right, rather than just thinking instantaneously some neurons are firing, they're going to make some other neurons fire, this is the way the machine works. If instead you think, okay, but why? Why is the thing configured that way? Then you realize, okay, well, it's configured that way because it has captured things it's learned from the past, because it's embodied those things in the structure of the nervous system in ways that allow us to act for reasons and allow us to have goals for our future selves, and so on. So it's a different way of thinking about causation that isn't reductive in either of the ways that you already mentioned, which is a vertical reduction from thinking, okay, you've got some mental cognitive activities that we can describe at the level of psychology, but really it's all just neurons firing, right? So that's this, you're going down scales of reality, as it were, right? So from mental scales, it's very holistic, down to the neural level. And of course, you can keep going, right? Why stop at the neural level? Why say the causation is there? Maybe the causation is just the laws of physics, right? It's all physical stuff. Then you have this horizontal reductionism, which is looking at a system, at one level, but saying it's this part of the system that's causing the behavior, or it's this part, right? It's an isolation, it's a decomposition of various bits of the system, like you would with a machine. And when you look at the brain, it's very obvious, in fact, any living cell, that it's a holistic system, that it has different elements they're not acting like parts of a machine, they're playing parts. And they all have relations with each other. And it's the conditional relations that they have with each other, which makes the whole thing very holistic and not decomposable. And then there's a third type, right, which people don't talk about much, but it's temporal reduction, right? It's saying right now, all the causation in the system is happening right now. And philosophers use the word synchronic for that. So synchronous, right? So right now, that's where all the business is happening, but it misses out what's called the diachronic, the causation that happens through time, that explains why the system is the way it is. Why, when it gets some stimulus, it reacts the way that it does. It's because it's learned things, because it's embodied everything, all your memories and goals and everything, beliefs and desires and everything else, right? So yeah, there's a way, I think, to take a holistic view towards causation in these systems that doesn't, I hope, just kind of descend into vague mysticism, right? Because we can actually formalize these kinds of things, and systems neuroscience, systems biology is managing to do that much better than it has before.
Yeah, and it just makes me think of the other, and this is just me, and I don't know why, but the external determinism is the one I think it stands out the most to me. That being that people like taking this view that we're sort of like billiard balls, and that we're just sort of pushed around. Whereas actually, because even in a way, and this is, you might sort of actually correct me here, I might have not thought of everything here, but regardless of, I suppose, one's even if you take a sort of an ontological kind of just purely material, sort of like materialistic view, whereby we are merely our neurons, even then we are delineated from our environment. And for those who are familiar with the term, like a Markov blanket, we're sort of partitioned from our environment. And you speak about this idea of how we need to, and within the sort of free energy principle and stuff, there's this idea of like, thermodynamic independence. We can't be sort of isomorphic with the environment.
Yeah.
And so even just with that is what we are. That is, we are that system as it moves through time. Does that make sense?
Yes. So there's two ways of thinking about that. We're the system moving through time, or we are the system through time. Right? We are the extension of the thing through time. Right? To be a self, the only thing it means to be a self is that you have some continuity through time, right? There's an organization of matter that constitutes George, and that is recognizable through moments of time. That's what it means to be George, right? To just have an instantaneous organization like you right now, that's not you. That doesn't entail everything about being you. It's the continuity through time that's important. And as you said, living organisms work hard to maintain that pattern that is themselves through time. Even single-celled organisms do that, right? And they do have this barrier with the environment, which for a bacterium or a single-celled organism is just a cell membrane or cell wall. But that establishes a causal barrier as well, right? So what that means is a lot of physical causes outside the organism and chemical goings on won't have any effect on what's going on inside the organism, right? But of course, some of them will. So it has to be able to be responsive to changes in the environment, but it also has to work hard when something changes in the environment to accommodate to that change in such a way that it can continue its own pattern, regardless of that thing that's outside. So I think a lot of the basic sort of idea of why it is that organisms develop control systems comes from this idea. It's why I started this book on free will with talking about bacteria and the origin of life, because that you have to get that concept clear, I think, to ground the notions of purpose and meaning and value, right? What it means to an organism for something to change in the environment and for it to have to react to that in order to keep persisting. So it's an idea that organisms have to do thermodynamic work to keep themselves organized is the basis for ideas of purpose and meaning and value. So even a single-celled organism is doing work to stay organized, right? The second law of thermodynamics says that it should become one with the universe. It should go to equilibrium with its surroundings, and it's trying not to. And so it's doing that work in order to persist. And that sounds like I'm ascribing psychological striving to this thing, but it's just basically a chemical, physical description of what's happening, right? Things that persist tend to have that property that they're configured in such a way to do that work such that they persist. Now, the things that persist better in a changeable world are the ones that are able to sense something out in the world and then respond internally and reconfigure themselves in such a way that they can go on persisting. So if, for example, the food sources change, or it goes from an oxygenated environment to a non-oxygenated one, then many organisms can reconfigure their internal metabolism, right? However, at some point in evolution, a new trick arose, which is that they can move, right? So sometimes this reconfiguring yourself is just not enough. Maybe the environment has changed so much, maybe there's no food left because you've eaten it all, and all the other bacteria have eaten it all, right? So then a good thing to be able to do is move. And then a question is, well, where should I move? And under that scenario, it becomes valuable for an organism to get some information about what's out in the world and then use that to direct its own actions. So for me, that's the very basis of decision-making and control and adaptive behavior. And goal-directed behavior that we can see right from the get-go. Now, to come back to the question that prompted this about external determinism, we can think of determinism in a few different ways. There's lots of, actually, it's a term that gets very confused because some people use it to mean neural determinism and some people use it to mean physical determinism and lots of other things in between. But one thing that people often want to say to ascribe freedom of action to an organism or an entity is at least to say it wasn't forced by something outside it, right? So it wasn't just pushed, it jumped, or it moved by itself. Right? So living organisms, by virtue of having this kind of organization where they have a barrier with the environment and they have control systems that allow them to act, it's not just that they're not pushed around by things in the environment, it's that they push back, right? They are causes unto themselves. And that's the sort of the very basis of thinking of something like a bacterium as an agent, is that it's a thing, it's an entity that persists through time, that can act as an entity, not just as something that's not pushed around. It's not just pushed around by things outside it, it's also not pushed around by its own parts. Right? So this isolated view where you could say the reason the bacterium moved over there is this protein was phosphorylated and that protein was phosphorylated, and something happened inside it. It looks like you can decompose it and say, well, it's not doing anything. It's a place where things are happening and it's being pushed around by those happenings. And that's exactly the same concern that people have when they say we are just being pushed around by happenings in our brains, as opposed to saying, no, there's a holistic self that's using that machinery in order to guide its behavior through time.
Yes. Yeah, there's so much, and there's almost so many levels of analysis to kind of like think about this and sort of like and think of what's yeah, and I think that idea of historicity is really important, isn't it? How often I think we forget to realize that our current state is informed by the choices that we as a system made at a particular point. In fact, and I think this might be a good I think the Libet study is quite interesting, because I think it's almost like you can use it to think about some of these ideas. So maybe it'd be best if you perhaps describe to those who aren't familiar with it what the Libet study was, and then what the initial kind of reaction to it was, and perhaps how some of these ideas can actually change how we see it.
Yeah. So the Libet experiment is this famous experiment, which has to be one of the most over-interpreted sets of findings in science, I think, because so it's an experiment that aimed to record from people's brains when they're making a decision and try and figure out the timing of things in the brain relative to the timing of the feeling of when they thought they were making a decision. So the setup is a bit weird. Basically, it's very simple though. So the person has they're just instructed to move their hand or lift a finger whenever the urge takes them, right? So specifically on a whim, that's the instructions, and that's important. And they have a device that will record electrical activity from the muscles in their hand, so they can get a very precise reading on when the muscle movement happened. And then they also have an EEG cap, which is recording their brain activity. Okay. Now, the setup is this. They are instructed to sit there with this EEG recording their brain activity, and every once in a while, whenever the hell they feel like it, lift a finger or flex their wrist. And the EEG records some activity in their brain in the motor area, which is or the premotor area, which is where movements are prepared, which occurs prior to the movement of the hand. Okay, so far so good, right? That makes sense. What's interesting and what was really surprising was that they were also instructed to watch a clock that was sort of ticking around like this, and to try and figure out and report when they felt like they were going to make a movement. And what was interesting, you would think naively that you would have the feeling you want to make a movement, and then you would have this preparatory activity in your brain, and then you would make the movement. But what happened was that the order of the feeling and the preparatory activity in the brain were reversed. Right? So there was a delay between when the preparatory activity in the brain started to become evident and the moment when the person said, that was when I felt the urge to move. And that delay was about 350 milliseconds, which doesn't sound long, but it's an eternity in this sort of neural system. Now, the way that was over-interpreted, in my view, is that this was proof that your brain was making the decision and it was only reporting to you, the conscious self, right, in this dualist kind of framing, at some point afterwards. And that kind of fit with a whole body of literature which suggested that actually what your conscious mind is doing is rationalizing your actions post hoc. Your brain is making the decisions and you're conscious mind is telling a story about why you did those, right? So it's this whole view that your conscious self is just not in charge of anything, right? It's just a fable generating machine. It's just making up shit afterwards to make you feel good about what you did, right? Which is just a weird framing. Like, why would we have this whole thing if it's just constantly wrong and mistaken all the time? And there's an extrapolation from the psychological literature, which, can show occasionally there are scenarios you can set up that prime somebody to do something in a way that they weren't really aware of. Right? But just because that can happen, it doesn't mean we're never aware of why we do things. It's just a weird, total non sequitur, actually, to say, whoa, well, look, here, sometimes you weren't aware in this situation. I tricked you into doing that with this clever setup. Therefore, you're never aware of what you're doing or never in control, right? It just doesn't follow. So the Libet experiments have been massively extrapolated, and even by Libet himself, to suggest that they have a relevance for the question of free will in the first instance, and basically show that we don't have the kind of free will that we thought we did. Now, I think that's mistaken, and many other people do, for several reasons. The first reason is that the whole setup of the scenario is that you go in, you agree, you decide at a point prior to the EEG being put on your head to take part in this experiment and to follow the instructions of the experimenter, right? And that's when you made a rational, deliberative decision of the type that we normally talk about when we're talking about free will, right? The kind of decision we care about. Then you're told, just flex your finger whenever the urge takes you, right? That's literally the farthest thing from a deliberative decision that you could get, right? And in fact, what it seems to happen is that at that point, people just allow some of the noisiness that's going on in neural circuits to accumulate to a certain kind of threshold, which initiates an action, right? So they sort of decide to allow that to happen, but what's happening in there is really just noisy randomness, and we can show that by looking at different ways of looking at the same kind of recordings. So for me, the experiment is just nothing to do with free will at all. All it shows is that under some circumstances, for some kind of behaviors where you're completely indifferent, there's nothing riding on it, you don't care about the outcome at all. Under those kinds of circumstances, you may allow your brain circuits to drive a behavior. Okay. Yeah. And it's just a mistake. Again, it's the same non sequitur to say that because under some circumstances that happens, then every decision that must be happening. Right? It just doesn't follow. And in fact, there's a really nice follow-up experiment done by Yuri Maus and Liad Mudrik and colleagues, where they did the same experiment, except instead of having this random thing with nothing riding on it, they used a scenario where they were giving people money for a charity that they cared about, right? So they asked people that, and it was real money for a real charity, and something was riding on whether they lifted their right hand or their left hand at some given time. And when they did that, then the activity doesn't track this so-called readiness potential in the motor area. It basically, because they care about the decision, it shows that there's a different kind of decision making going on in the brain, and the timing of it matched much better. That, like, they were consciously aware of the decision, and it matched the dynamics in the brain. So, yeah, I think that experiment just doesn't show what people have thought it shows, and even if it did, it doesn't mean what they think it means, because it's restricted to this very, very particular scenario. And there's a broader lesson there, which is that there isn't one answer to this question of how we make decisions, right? It's really variable over different kinds of scenarios. So in some scenarios, you will have learned from going through life that in some scenario, there's a good thing to do. Right. So when you wake up in the morning, you may not just wander around going, whoa, what the hell should I do now? Right. You know what to do when you get up in the morning. Go have a shower, have breakfast, whatever, have a cup of coffee. Right? So lots of our behavior is guided habitually like that because we have this historicity, because we have learned through time that's a good thing to do, and we have systems that enable us to guide our behavior without having to give it much conscious thought, right? So it's absolutely true that a lot of our behavior is subconsciously guided. That doesn't mean it's not you doing it. It just is an efficient way to guide behavior that doesn't require a lot of cognitive resources or time. But then you're also going to have scenarios where you don't quite know what to do, right? It's a slightly novel scenario. It may be similar to other types of scenarios you've encountered before, and you can use that information to suggest some things to do now and evaluate what their likely outcomes will be, and then choose the one that you think will be best, right? So that's where you've got more effortful, deliberative decision making that takes a bit more time. Right? It's not as efficient, but it's more flexible. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got behaviors that may be going on where you just don't care, right? You just don't care what the outcome is. You don't have to deliberate because nothing is riding on it. You're just indifferent to it. And then you'll just allow some brain circuits, again, these subconscious things, to drive the outcome, like when you flex your finger in that libet task. So a lot of the difficulties in the free will debate come from looking at one type of scenario and extrapolating that to everything else and thinking there's one rule, there's one thing, and that's just not the case, right? Decision making takes lots of different forms, and there's a continuum, and there's different brain systems involved, and you can shift between them depending on the demands of the situation you find yourself in.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, it's like even taking that example in that scenario with the Libet study, again, it's this sort of strange thing whereby we sort of somehow we extricate ourselves from that. So like you said, the participants decided to go into that study. And I think in the book you talk about this idea of noise. And actually, yes, we identify activity sort of neuronally through some recording, but that noise though has to still be interpreted. It still has to be sort of the agent as a whole has decided what that sort of noise means.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of meaning element, and that sort of it means something to the system as a whole. The system has decided what to do with it almost.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that
and the other thing, sorry, you carry on.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing that strikes me again with this study is this strange thing we have whereby we go, look, it's there, it's the brain, therefore it's not us, or it's almost like it's the brain and it's subconscious, therefore it's not us.
Exactly.
But even if it's subconscious, it's still the system, and the fact that it's subconscious might even be that it's because it's become, not in this instance, automated from conscious decisions in the past.
Exactly. Because of the choices that you have made in the past, now your behavior, now you're using your brain to control your behavior in a habitual way that's not so overtly deliberative. And that's fine. That's still you doing stuff for your reasons based on your own past history, right? So there's a couple of things there that I want to pick up on. One is the noisiness of the system, and the other is the meaning, and the meaning is really important. But on the noisiness front, so we have neurons are very noisy. Okay, they're made with little jittery components. There's loads of little ions buzzing around, right? Proteins are binding and separating in a kind of a non-deterministic fashion, in a probabilistic fashion based on the kinetics of and their relative affinities and all the rest of that kind of stuff. So if you imagine what's going on inside a single neuron, you put all these proteins jittering around the place and interacting and coming apart. And those dynamics will determine things like how many ion channels open, and whether it reaches a threshold to fire an action potential, and how many action potentials it fires, or whether when it's detecting neurotransmitter, how many channels open and how sensitive it is, and so on. And those, all of those parameters can be regulated through time. And a lot of what's facing the challenge facing the organism is how to corral all of that noisiness and still have a robust system that can function, right? And it's funny if you think about, from a physics point of view, this idea that all of everything that happens is very predetermined, even down at the atomic level or the quantum level, then you have, like, a lot of the free will debate starts with that premise. It's like physical determinism is true. How can we either, what should we think about free will given that premise? And usually there's two conclusions. Either free will is impossible because only one timeline can ever happen, and it's all the causation is down at the level of physics, or we can kind of protect a notion of moral responsibility even without the notion of choice. So that's the compatibilist view, which I don't have much sympathy for, frankly. But if you actually look at the evidence from physics, it doesn't at all say that everything proceeds deterministically. That's not a result from physics. It's this kind of idealization that's useful mathematically for some sorts of bits of physical calculations and so on. But there's nothing in physics that proves that. And in fact, quantum physics is famously indeterministic. But actually, there's a whole arguments to be made for why classical physics is also indeterministic. And if that's the case, then it flips the script entirely, right? So rather than asking, where could the freedom come from in this supposedly deterministic world? Instead, you say, no, like, the future is open. Many things could happen because they're not completely dictated by the laws of physics and the current state of the system. The future is open. Then for an organism, you have to ask, well, where does the control come from? Given this wide open future of many things that could happen, how does the organism, as a collective organization thing, impose constraints on itself and the world in such a way as to make happen what it wants to happen, right? That's the essence of control. And that's the question that is really so interesting. And what has evolved is systems that allow organisms to control their behavior, to control their biochemistry, to move around in the world and control things out in the world, despite the noisiness of their components. However, occasionally, they can let the noise go free, right? They can just sort of decide to let the noisiness have more play than at other times. And that's what's happening, I think, in the Libet experiment. People are deciding to allow the noisiness to be the thing that drives the system to a threshold at which time it makes this decision. And we could say the same thing if we're faced with just a decision that we don't care about, right? Should we have Coke or Pepsi? Who cares? I don't care. So I'll let my brain decide on a whim. So what? So yeah, there are times when noise is not a bug in the system; it's a feature that the system actually uses. And for another example, many organisms have these escape reflexes, where if they're threatened by something, they'll jump or swim away in some direction, and usually it's a random direction. And that's really, really adaptive, because if their escape response was always in the same direction, then a predator could learn that really easily, right? So it's very useful sometimes to use those noisy elements. So sorry, that was a long-winded digression, but it's important to think about that because it gets to this other question of meaning. How could it be that the meaning of neural states is what's important in the system, not just the physical instantiation? And the reason why there's some scope for that kind of causation to happen is precisely because of this physical indeterminacy at the lowest levels, right? If it were the case that at the lowest levels of the way my system is configured right now, all the atoms and molecules and quantum fields, if that plus the laws of physics completely determine the next state, then all of the causation is happening down here. There's no reason, there's no scope, there's no slack in the system for the way it's organized to be having any causal effect, because the causation is exhausted down at the lowest level. If it isn't like that, which it isn't, then what that means is that there's scope for the way the system is organized to be exercising some constraint on what happens in the system. Right? So there's sort of a top-down organizational effect, which is quite commonplace. There's nothing there's nothing bizarre or magical about it. It's not violating any laws of physics. It's not reaching down and changing the laws of physics that's happening down here. It's just setting the conditions under which they play out. So, for example, in our computers, right, we're both using these laptop computers. The way that they're designed and constructed, the way the hardware is constructed, and the way the software is at play is affecting how the electrons move around in there. It's not changing the laws of physics that operate on them, but it's absolutely having important causal effects on them. And in fact, in this case, towards a function, right? Because it's designed. And what happens in evolution is that you can get the same kinds of functional organization, functionalities emerge, not because there's a designer, but because evolution does the design work to ensure that organisms have these systems that enable them to do things that are adaptive and help them persist. And in nervous systems, what that comes to mean is that the system is operating over patterns that mean something relevant to the organism. So when we're looking at scenes, for example, we've got photons hitting our photoreceptors, and there's some kind of electrical, mechanical causation, electrochemical causation that's happening in our optic nerves and so on, right? But that's only a little bit of the picture. What's actually happening is that our retina is configured to extract certain kinds of patterns and do feature segmentation on the scene, that the data that's incoming. And what's actually happening is that we're passing meaningful information up to the visual cortex, and it gets propagated through there and transformed and interpreted as it goes, such that eventually we're operating over these meaningful patterns that represent things out in the world that we care about at the scale that we care about. We don't care about photons, right? We care about objects, and we care about people. And those states, when we're representing those, will have at any moment a particular neural instantiation. And you could say, well, okay, well, then it's just, we're back to the neurons causing the stuff. But the important thing is that the system is configured that it doesn't care what the details of that instantiation are. It cares what the meaning is, right? You could change a lot of the details, and if it still means George's face versus Kevin's face, then the outcome is no different, right? But if you change it enough that it now means George's face instead of Kevin's face, well, then the outcome would be different. So that's where, we can move away from thinking of the brain as this neurochemical machine where all the causation is at the level of neurons, to thinking about, no, well, it's using neurons, it's using patterns, but what it's doing is operating over meaningful patterns that mean something to the organism.
Yeah, and it's just yes, it just brings me back to the kind of when you explain that, and it all makes sense. It makes me wonder, so what is this, because as you say, it's almost like the agent. It almost sounds odd to say uses the neurons, but I mean, how do you make sense out of the kind of, this sort of, but for those that go, oh well, you're just neurons, and you're saying, well, you're not, you're sort of instantiated by neurons, but even then the neurons can kind of change and what they mean, or they're, it's not what they are, but it's what they mean, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a way to think about it, George, which is thinking about causation. So say you're looking at some system, and you see there's a state of the system, and then there's a following state. So let's say the state of the system is A, and there's a subsequent event that happens, which we'll call X. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we have an if A, then X kind of situation, right? Now, when you see a correlation like that, when you see one thing followed by another, you might think A is causing X. Right? And the way to test that is to change A and see if X still happens, right? So it's this counterfactual idea of causation, which, it just fits. We say if A was the cause of X, then if A didn't happen, X wouldn't have happened. That's what it means for A to be the cause of X under that kind of definition, right? Now, if you look in the brain, then you can try and see, well, at what level is that causal sensitivity inherent? Is it at the level of a particular pattern of neural firing right now in some area of the brain that makes this area of the brain respond in a certain way? If that were true, then if I change the details here, then this state should not emerge. Right? And as it happens, you can change loads of the details here because this population that's sort of monitoring its inputs is coarse graining and filtering information out of here. It's looking for patterns. That's the way that those systems are configured. This thing is not sensitive to the details down here unless it interprets them as moving suddenly from pattern A to pattern B. Right? And pattern A and B mean something to the organism. It's those global patterns that are the things that act as these internal representations, things that we can think about, or things that at least that our brain meaningfully operates over. And in fact, we know that the details are arbitrary. They're sort of incidental. They vary from moment to moment. They even drift over time, but the meaning is maintained, and the system is sensitive to the global meaning of the pattern, not the neural details. So in that view, if you want to try and distinguish these two views, your neurons are causing the neural activity is causing what happens, or the meaning of the neural activity is causing what happens, then you're clearly at the second one, right? It's the meaning of the activity that's important. The neural details are not, because you can vary them. So this term is called multiple realizability. Right? A given pattern can be realized in many different ways, and it still means the same thing. And in a sense, it's like thinking about language or written text. I could write a text in italics or bold or capital letters or whatever, and it would still mean the same thing because we're not sensitive. Right? I could write it in different fonts. We're not sensitive to that unless we're really paying attention to it. But most of the time, the meaning of the word doesn't change, even though the details change. Right? So it's a kind of a semantic causation that emerges through time as the organism learns about things in the world, builds up this model of the world, so that when it has these meaningful states, part of that meaning is that it knows, for example, it recognizes an object because it's seen like an apple. It's seen apples before. It links to its past knowledge and its past experience with apples. It knows that you can eat it. It knows that you can throw it. It knows that they can be red or green or whatever, and so on. And then all of that meaningful information or knowledge is what the organism uses to guide its behavior through time. But what I want to emphasize is that all of that knowledge that I just talked about is agent level knowledge. Right? It's things that the agent can do with its affordances, its opportunities, it's relevant to agent level goals, and so on. And that's where the causation really is. But it's still the case that it's using this neural machinery in order to do that. So there doesn't have to be an either or. You can just think of it as different aspects of a system that's set up in order to be useful for the agent as a whole.
Yeah, and it makes me think of so it's this kind of like notion of sort of inference, and how sort of like say you have neural populations inferring the activity of other neural populations, and I suppose in like a predictive processing account, then it's like sort of the information is sort of constrained or contingent on the prior. And then, but the whole point is, at any level of any level of the sort of hierarchy or of it, whatever you're processing, let's say you're looking at a cup, and then you sort of like you ascend the hierarchy from the sort of basic features up into the sort of like abstract what actually it means. All of that, though, even though you can look at it quite close up and go, look, at this level, you're just identifying the features. It's always, though, whatever level you're looking at, it is embedded in the whole. It's always embedded in the whole.
Yes.
So even if you're getting the information from the level above, that is embedded, so it's always within the whole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this isolationist sort of project where you can say it was just this part of the brain that you're using, like you do it in isolation, is a bit of a fantasy, because really what happens is everything that you just described each system is effectively trying to predict its inputs, but based on context that it's getting, right? And that context and the conditionality is where all of the holistic business lies, right? And it comes from historicity. It also comes from your current state. What's your current motivations? All of those things are sort of tuning up or down. They're setting some of the parameters for what individual bits of the brain are kind of caring about. And it's imposing these sort of web of collective constraints where, the whole system, what the organism wants to happen is that the whole system will settle into a kind of an optimal outcome based on these constraints that are set up between all the various elements. And when it does that adaptively, then we get to keep on living, basically. So it allows you to optimize over many, many variables at once, to behave in a very flexible, context-dependent manner, to have sort of nested sets of goals that you prioritize in different ways that can be operating over very, very different timelines. And to sort of manage these agendas and behavior through time and juggle all these different variables in an optimal way as possible, given the incomplete information that you have, the uncertain information, the noisiness of your components, and the finite time that you have to make decisions. And all of that, right? All of that stuff happening is, I would say, just you making a decision. That's what that is. It's you making a decision based on all of those things all at once, based on you level imperatives and you level goals and you level incentives and so on.
Yeah. And again, it just makes me, it's just another sort of reminder of this sort of the pitfalls of reductionism. It's sort of, it just doesn't, we are beings, we are holistic, I exist, I am here,
Yes.
I am this entity, yes, you can go down to neurons, but you sort of,
Yeah.
well,
Well, what's interesting is that it's much more aligned with a process view of philosophy.
I was going to ask
So
you
the
about this.
idea
Yeah.
of process philosophy, which comes from, it's Heraclitus, but people like Whitehead and Bergson and others, at the turn of the last century, were very prominent in this. It was a view that we should not think of the world as populated by these physical objects and entities as the main primary elements of our ontology. We should think of processes and, in a sense, relations between them as the primary elements. Now, for me, I don't really, giving one of them primacy over the other is not so important, but what is important is that we should keep track of the fact that things are in flux and that the relations between them are elements that we should be paying a lot of attention to. And when you said you're a self, there you are, you're an entity. We say you're a being. And if you think about the word being, it's a verb, right? It's an activity. You are being. You're being yourself, and you're going to continue being yourself. You are a being in the sense that you would say you're a performance, right? You're performing yourself through time. And that for me is a key, another sort of very hidden, tacit philosophical bit of baggage that people come with, is that we have been conditioned over the last 100 years to think very much in terms of objects and substances and states, as opposed to relations and processes and flux. And so bringing the process view back into the picture is a way to get away from this very mechanistic, reductive kind of view. The other thing I'd say about reductionism is that it's been very successful experimentally in many, many ways, right? In that when we want to figure out what's happening within a system that's doing something, that's exposed to something, say a single cell, then what we do is we keep all of the other conditions as constant as possible, right? We do controlled experiments where everything is held constant, and we just expose the cell to, say, this sugar molecule or this acid or whatever it is, and we see how it behaves. And then we say, okay, well, this is how the bacterium responds to sugars. It's with this isolated component within it. But the world doesn't present itself like that, one thing at a time, one choice at a time, right? There's all kinds of stuff going on. So even a single bacterium has to integrate loads of signals at the same time and make a collective, holistic, all things considered judgment. I mean, that's an anthropomorphic term, right? But the system has to settle into the optimal state given all of the things it's exposed to and its recent history and the contextual relations between all of those things and so on. So yeah, it's much more holistic kind of view. And there's nothing wrong with the reductive experiments. The mistake is to adopt a theoretical reductionism on the back of that methodological reductionism. You can do the methods like that, just pull back and remember that the world is not like that.
Yes. Yeah. You mentioned in the book, it's Carlo Rovelli, and is that, I mean, has reading him and that sort of, does that kind of help make sense a bit more and sort of trickle a bit into that kind of like process thing of like
Yeah.
everything's relational?
Yeah. So Carlo Rovelli's work emphasizes relational aspects, which I think is key. And you can take that principle all the way up from, subatomic particles. That is the idea being that the subatomic particles have the properties they have by virtue of the relations that they have with other things, right? It's not the
Mm,
case that they just come along with intrinsic properties and then those determine how they relate with other things. It flips that idea. It says, no, that what does an intrinsic property mean? That like a private property doesn't mean anything, right? The only meaning of having a property is through relation with something else.
mm,
And so that becomes a really useful lens through which to see all kinds of things. And it goes up to all the way to the level of, for example, like what does it mean to be you or me in like a social sense? The what it means to be me, the whole everything it means to be me in my life is in some ways defined by all of my relationships that I have as a son and a father and a husband and a lecturer and a friend and whatever else is happening, right? So a lot of what it means to be any given thing, from a subatomic particle to a psychological entity, is in essence inherent in this web of relations that it has. And even within the brain, we were talking about these meaningful patterns. Those are all, again, relational. The pattern that's excited when you see an apple, the idea of an apple, that pattern itself doesn't have any appleness in it, right? It's just a tag that points to red, round, edible, throwable, right? All these concepts. Those concepts together, which are all relational in the world as well, that web of relations is what constitutes your schema or your idea of that concept. Now, you can use the local representation in order to do cognitive operations with that idea without having to define all these other things and keep them active, right? But yeah, the relational view, I think, is key. And again, it's just extremely holistic, right? You just can't, and
mm,
it's conditional and contextual. You just can't break apart the system and hope to still capture that, because it's only in the relations within the system that meaningfulness or those properties actually inhere.
mm. Yeah, and you can get really meta, and even that whole process itself is only happening, or like it's because it relates to you, in the
Absolutely.
yeah.
The way that you've learned things, the meaning for you of any of those ideas is based on your own history of relating with the world, right? So you know that an apple is edible because you tried to eat one before or you succeeded. Um, yeah, so I'm very much in favor of those relational, processual kinds of views. And what's important, I think, is to kind of emphasize that you can move from that metaphysics into an operationalizable physics or an operationalizable neuroscience, right? So you can do systems biology. You don't have to do these reductive kinds of things. And what's really exciting these days is that we have the tools to not just say in a single cell, look at the activity of one protein pathway or look at the levels of one gene product or another. We can look at all of the genes, right? We can look at all of the metabolic pathways almost at the same time, right? So we can get this holistic view where now we can see patterns within the thing. We see the patterns kind of morphing, the dynamics of as they move through a kind of the abstract collective space that they describe, basically. And you can do the same thing in neural populations. You can see that in fact it's not even just the current firing state of all the neurons in some area that's important. It's the dynamics of that firing that carries information within the system. And those dynamics then are also, we can start to measure, I mean, in some cases for very small creatures, all of the neurons in the brain or the whole nervous system at the same time as it's doing things. And as we're doing that, we're developing these mathematical tools and computational tools that allow us to see what the system is doing, not just what's happening, which a lot of biology has been concerned with. We just describe what's happening. Right. Instead, we can take a kind of an engineering point of view or a computational view and say, well, no, okay, yeah, this is what's happening, but this is what it's doing. These are the operations that are important. It's this, when it moves from this pattern to that pattern, that's when the organism moves, or that's when the organism perceives something versus doesn't, right? So for me, what's really exciting these days is that we have this kind of return of holistic metaphysics, these process views, relational views of thinking about things, but now they're made concrete and formalizable, and scientists can get to grips with them. They're not just vague, nebulous notions that people would kind of nod towards and then go, even if they thought that that was right, it was like, okay, but I can't do anything with that right now. I can only do my reductive experiments. That's changing, and I think that's really, it's a paradigm shift that's underway at the moment.
You think so? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a kind of a quiet one, but I think we'll look back at this period in time as the time when we moved away from very reductive ways of thinking to holistic ways, because the holistic ways finally were scientifically accessible to us.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, actually, from someone like yourself who's so sort of embedded in kind of academia and sort of in the weeds of doing research and stuff. Because I sense that as well. I'm curious. So have you always had this sort of disposition, or did it kind of, were you at one point, sort of far away from this?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think in my scientific work, starting when I was a graduate student and so on, we were trying to isolate, in this case, particular proteins that were involved in the development of the fruit fly nervous system. And the idea was that, you've got this big, complicated nervous system. When different neurons are born, they have to connect to each other in highly specific ways. So how does that happen? And the notion was that there must be some cues that guide them, so proteins that are expressed in one bit of the brain versus another, that just like a bacterium doing chemotaxis, the nerves would send out this projection and they would sort of sniff out the chemical landscape that they were navigating through, and one nerve might be attracted to one bit and another nerve might be repelled by it and go here and there, right? So that was the sort of broad logical notion. And what we were trying to do was identify very specific molecules and receptors that had that job in the nervous system. And we did. And it was an interesting time in the 90s when people were suddenly finding some of these molecules pretty quickly. So the idea was, for example, that you have a molecule that's expressed like at the midline of the nervous system, and then you've got nerves on each side that are attracted to that molecule, and then they cross the midline. And some nerves cross the midline, and some don't. And we could try to figure out what's the difference between the ones that do, that don't. What are the cues that they're responding to? And there was almost a kind of a drive to want a nice, neat, clean, complete story, where we could say, here's the molecule we identified, it's doing the whole job, and whether these guys express receptor A or receptor B is the whole story of what happens, right? Pretty quickly, it emerged that that's not the way the system works. It's not that each neuronal decision point is controlled by one molecule and one receptor. It's a bunch of them, actually. It's a load of receptors. It's contextual. It's combinatorial. And so what I've, we sort of, I guess in my own way of thinking about it, moved from this very discrete, isolatable kind of logic to one that's much more contextual and kind of organic, where you have a set of molecules that are kind of generating a landscape that the neuron navigates through, and it's got a set of receptors that are interacting with each other in highly dynamic kind of a ways, and it's even changing its responsiveness as it goes along, which is what enables it to move on from some attractive intermediate target and find its eventual target. So yeah, I guess intellectually what interested me, and what I came to realize was what interested me, was how does this whole thing work? How does this whole genetic program work to set up the whole brain? And how does the way the whole brain is organized map onto behavioral traits and so on? So I guess I started to have a kind of holistic interest in the logic of the whole system, right? Not just the mechanics of individual elements or processes within it. But yeah, from the beginning, though, it was very much a kind of reductive, isolated view. Let's find the thing that's doing this process. It's just that the data eventually started to tell us that was too simplistic a view to capture the richness of what was actually going on.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's like and again it's like it's not trying to throw away or the kind of reductionist approach has enabled technology to advance. It's helps us sort of isolate causal sort of determinacy and stuff like this, and but I'm just curious, are you familiar? Have you familiar with Iain McGilchrist or his work?
I am, and I don't know his work very well. I'm
Because
familiar
I
with some
think
of it.
yeah, I think you would find just talking to you, I think you'd find it really interesting. And he just very much talks. I suppose he's a psychiatrist, but he's also a philosopher. But he very much speaks around these kind of ideas, but basically the enterprise of science and the sort of basic premises of how we can come to science. One is one of like utility. We can sort of like see how science can give us sort of utilize and have power over things.
Yeah.
And there's this other way in sort of trying to understand the holistic kind
Yeah.
of meaning of things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And of course, what the reductive approach offers is the potential for control, right? And what's important is to recognize that even when you have control over a system, it doesn't mean you have a full causal explanation of it. And I think that's a mistake people fall into. So when, for example, they're using something like optogenetics to drive a behavior, and they say, look, when I activate these neurons, this behavior happens, the animal does this behavior, and when I inhibit the neurons, the animal doesn't do the behavior. Therefore, this is the bit of the brain that is responsible for that behavior, and I have a full understanding of what's causing that behavior. Well, no, you don't, right? You've just manipulated it. You have control over it. That doesn't mean you know why the system is operating that way, how it got wired that way, and everything else in the context and under which that system operates, right? But what's really key, of course, for medical things is that we absolutely can't just have this holistic woo sort of thing, right? We can't say, oh, I understand the system. I have explained it with this lovely processual view. That may be absolutely the right way to think about it, but it's absolutely not a useful way to intervene on it, right? So there, we still need to recognize that those holistic dynamics do emerge from and depend on individual components. They do it in messy ways. That's the problem. So what has gotten people into trouble is using these very reductive experiments and say, oh, I isolate this biochemical pathway or this pathway in these cells in a dish, and I can turn on cell proliferation or turn it off, and I can use this to treat cancer, right? And within the dish, the things are really nicely behaved because you're controlling all of the other conditions and so on. When you put your drug on, you get a really nice clean effect, and then it goes through all the steps of pharma to try and make a drug, go to clinical trials, and then what happens with most things when they go to clinical trials is reality bites them in the ass. It turns out to be just much messier, much more context dependent, and so on. And that's why very few drugs actually make it all the way through that pipeline from even very strong, clear preclinical findings to clinical approval as a drug. And of course, there's even the ones that are approved have all kinds of side effects and so on. So yeah, I think this idea that there's two purposes is absolutely spot on, right? We want to explain and understand in a global way, but we also want to be able to control and intervene on the system in particular ways. And what's needed in order to predict which particular interventions will lead to the emergence of global states that you want is an understanding of how those things map to each other. And that, I think, I mean, like psychiatry is a very good example of the challenge there, because we have things like schizophrenia and autism and epilepsy and other conditions where, mutations in very particular genes that are encoding particular proteins expressed in particular cells in the developing brain or the mature brain can lead to a much higher risk of these conditions emerging. So you've got at one level a change in DNA sequence in a zygote, right, in a single cell, and then ultimately you've got symptoms where that are manifesting at the level of somebody's psychology, literally thinking that the CIA is tapping their phone or something like that, right? And what we need to understand is what is the causal link between those things, right? Because we know that there's an originating risk factor here, and we know that there's an emergent kind of behavior, but it's a mistake in my mind to try and think that there's a very direct relationship between those. There's a very emergent relationship that happens through all of the processes of development and the processes of a person's life. And it's important to kind of track that such that we can go from this reductive level to the emergent level in a way that ultimately might allow us to say, you know what, if we intervene here, that might help shift the state of the brain from psychotic regime back into a healthy regime.
Yeah, it's interesting when you spoke there about how the sort of you can have a genetic sort of disposition or predisposition to being vulnerable to sort of schizophrenia, and then it's like trying to understand what there's this gap. And when you did that, I was like, yeah, and because there's within that gap there is so much meaning,
Yes.
there's so much meaning between that gap, and it's trying to perhaps better map that better, and I suppose people do that, whether it's like through like exploring, for example, like early life adversity, how does that influence and interact with those dispositions?
I mean, the key thing is that in that gap, that's the person, right? That's where the person is. It's not just a biological system. That's where their experiences come in. It's where the nature of their self and the relations that they have with other people comes in. And so, yeah, I think that we need, in a sense, to have a science of selves that is neither mystical woo or so holistic that we can't understand that the sense of the self can be impaired or impinged on by very particular factors like a mutation in a particular base of DNA, but at the same time, we don't want to reduce the person all the way down to the biological level. We need to have a science where we can say, okay, yes, this is a physical system that has some of these physical relationships within it, but it also has these emergent properties, and we need to understand the whole thing and the context of that system within its social relations and all the rest of that. But I think I'm hopeful that we're moving in that direction. As I said, some of the tools and some of the concepts that we now have, I think, can allow us to marry those approaches much better.
Brilliant. And I think that's probably quite a nice way to wrap up.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. Well, thanks a million.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise.
Yeah, as I say, yeah, for people, if you've enjoyed listening to this, I will link Kevin's books, also the blog, and yeah, I will personally continue to follow your work. I find it very engaging and yeah, interesting.
Great. Well, thanks very much.
All right, Kevin.